Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to slip back into the world of medieval Europe, a time of castles, crusades, and, if we're being honest, questionable smells. So, if you've got your blanket, your tea, maybe a candle that smells a little nicer than a 14th century chamber pot, let's begin, because here's the thing. Whenever we picture the Middle Ages, we imagine knights in shining armor, queens in flowing gowns, and monks carefully illuminating manuscripts. What we don't usually imagine is the fact that most of these people lived in a world where soap was optional, rats were practically domestic pets, and the concept of deodorant was basically just flowers shoved into your clothes. Now, don't get me wrong. Medieval people weren't completely clueless. They did wash, sometimes. But if you're imagining a daily hot shower, fresh linens, and toothpaste with sparkles, no. Instead, think occasional rinse in a wooden tub, maybe some herbs rubbed on your armpits, and teeth that look like they've been through the 100 Years' War. Let's float into the public bathhouse. Because yes, medieval Europeans loved them. In fact, in the early Middle Ages, bathhouses were all over the place, especially in towns. They inherited the idea from the Romans, who basically built spas wherever they conquered. But unlike the Roman luxury of marble pools, medieval baths were more like big hot tubs filled with questionable water, shared by everyone in the community. Picture a giant wooden barrel, heated by a fire, with a bunch of people sitting together, marinating. And yes, you were often sharing this space with neighbors, strangers, and let's just say, germs. And here's the twist. People in the Middle Ages actually thought bathing too much was unhealthy. The belief was that warm water opened up your pores, which made your body more vulnerable to disease. So the logic was, sure, take a bath once in a while, but don't overdo it, unless you want the Black Death to crawl right in. It's the medieval equivalent of your grandmother telling you not to go outside with wet hair. Royalty, of course, had their own bathing routines, but don't imagine gilded jacuzzis. Kings and queens had large wooden tubs hauled into their chambers, filled by servants carrying buckets of heated water. Sometimes they'd add herbs or rose petals to make it smell less like wet dog. And because medieval people loved multitasking, these baths could double as dining events. There are records of nobles literally sitting in the bath while eating a roast dinner and conducting business. Imagine your boss calling a meeting, except everyone is half submerged in lukewarm water that hasn't been changed in days. Relaxing, right? Let's not forget dental care. Toothpaste, as we know it, didn't exist. Instead, medieval people had tooth powders, mixtures of crushed herbs, salt, sometimes even ground up bones, or oyster shells. Yes, oyster shells. Nothing says minty fresh, like scraping your gums with seafood residue. And toothbrushes weren't really a thing either. You might chew on a twig, rub your teeth with a rag, or just let nature take its course. So, when you picture a medieval banquet, imagine the smell of roasted meats, spiced wine, and a chorus of bad breath wafting across the hall. Speaking of smells, deodorant in the Middle Ages was creative. The upper classes stuffed herbs and flowers into their clothes to mask body odor. Lavender, rosemary, and mint were common. Think of it as carrying around a little potpourri sachet, except instead of freshening up your drawer, it's desperately trying to hide the fact that you haven't bathed in weeks. The lower classes didn't have the luxury of rosemary sprigs, so for them, personal fragrance was just whatever scent their daily labor provided. Cow dung, sweat, or smoke from the fire. Take your pick. Now, the bathroom situation. Yes, we have to talk about it. Castles had garderobes, which were small chambers with a wooden seat over a chute, leading straight down the wall and into the moat. Romantic, isn't it? The problem was, many castles didn't actually have running water in the moat, so waste just collected, which meant castle courtyards could smell less like roses and more like medieval reality. And of course, if you were poor, you didn't have a garderobe. You had a bucket, or more accurately, a chamber pot. These were emptied into the street, and that's why medieval cities smelled the way they did, like a mixture of mud, manure, and human waste. Truly a nose-friendly time. But believe it or not, there were medieval hygiene laws in cities like London, Paris, and Florence. Local officials actually fined people for dumping waste directly in the street. Of course, enforcing this was tricky, because half the city was doing it. There are records of medieval neighbors suing each other over whose chamber pot contents ended up on whose doorstep. So next time you complain about noisy upstairs neighbors, just remember, it could be worse. And while we're on the subject, laundry. Washing clothes wasn't a daily routine. Linen shirts were worn under clothes to absorb sweat, and those got washed more often. But outer garments, like wool gowns or tunics, could go weeks or months without cleaning. Sometimes they'd just be brushed or aired out. Soap existed, but it was harsh, made from animal fat and lye, and could damage fabrics. So, yes, people smelled. But here's the funny part. They were so used to it, they didn't even notice. Of course, plague and disease shaped a lot of medieval attitudes toward hygiene. During outbreaks of the Black Death, for example, people were convinced that bathing was dangerous since it supposedly opened the body to bad air, miasma. So, ironically, during the worst health crises, people reduced their washing, which did not help. Let's pause here and drift into one more detail. Perfume. The wealthy absolutely adored it. Imported from the Middle East, perfumes made from rose water, musk, and ambergris, which, by the way, is whale vomit. Yes, really, were prized luxuries. Nobles would drench themselves in it. It was less about smelling good and more about proving you could afford to literally bathe in liquids shipped across continents. So if you met a medieval duke, he might reek of unwashed clothes and exotic perfume layered on top, a sensory experience you wouldn't forget. All right, that's a gentle start into the world of medieval hygiene. Smelly, strange, and sometimes surprisingly organized. In our next part, we'll keep floating deeper, looking at now that we've waded through the tubs and garderobes, let's drift into something a little closer to the head. Literally, because while medieval people didn't always bathe as often as we'd expect, they were very invested in hair, beards, and the eternal fight against lice. Yes, lice, the tiny freeloaders of history. If you lived in the Middle Ages, chances are you had them. Everyone did. Peasants, monks, knights, even kings. It wasn't a matter of if. It was just part of life, like rain, taxes, or the fact that your cousin was probably also your in-law. People called lice companions, which is a very polite way of saying, I can't get rid of them, so I might as well act like we're friends. Now, to deal with them, people used fine-toothed combs, often made of bone or wood. These were called night combs, and archaeologists have dug up plenty of them, usually still containing fossilized lice, which means that even 700 years later, medieval, parasites are still clinging on, refusing to leave. Dedicated little guys. Shaving your head was another strategy. Monks, for example, wore tonsures, those circular bald patches surrounded by a ring of hair, supposedly a symbol of humility. Realistically, also a convenient way to make lice slightly easier to control. If you can't beat them, at least reduce their real estate. And let's not forget beards. Styles varied by time and place. Sometimes long and flowing was fashionable, sometimes short and neat. But whatever the style, lice were guaranteed tenants. Beards could also get greasy and dirty pretty quickly, so men used oils or even powders to make them smell less like the inside of a tavern. Think of it as medieval beard balm, but instead of cedarwood musk or vanilla bourbon, the scent was rosemary and maybe rancid olive oil. Women's hair care was a whole different world. Noble women often wore their hair long, but married women were expected to cover it with veils or elaborate headdresses. Washing hair was tricky, since soap could make it dry and brittle, so rinses with herbs were more common. A favorite ingredient? Rosemary water. Because apparently, if you're in the Middle Ages, rosemary solves everything. Bad breath, smelly clothes, greasy hair, and maybe even your existential despair. And here's a fun detail. Medieval women sometimes used lye. Yes, the same caustic substance used to make soap, to bleach their hair lighter. This was risky, because lye can literally burn your scalp. But beauty is pain, right? Blonde hair was especially prized in parts of Europe, probably thanks to medieval poets describing fair-haired maidens in every other ballad. So, if nature didn't give you flaxen locks, chemistry, and some mild scarring might. Makeup also existed, not in the way we think of today, but powders and rouges were used by noble women to pale their skin and redden their cheeks. Pale skin was fashionable because it showed you didn't have to labor outside. So, people rubbed mixtures of ground chalk, white lead, or even arsenic onto their faces. Yes, arsenic. Imagine slowly poisoning yourself just to look like you hadn't seen the sun. And we think modern beauty standards are rough. Now, let's slide back to hygiene tools. We've already mentioned combs, but people also used tweezers, ear scoops, and nail cleaners. Archaeologists find little toiletry kits with all three bundled together, almost like medieval Swiss army knives. The irony is that while these tools were designed to keep you neat, the bigger hygiene issues, like the fact that you hadn't washed in a month, were harder to tackle. Clothing also played a role in hygiene. Remember those linen undergarments? They weren't just for modesty. They absorbed sweat and oil from your body. which meant you could wash the linen shirt instead of your outer clothes. It was basically a medieval undershirt/sponge. But even then, washing linen wasn't daily. It was more like once a week, if you were diligent. For poorer families, maybe once a month, and by then, the shirt was basically stiff enough to walk on its own. Smell was, of course, everywhere. Medieval people tried to combat it with herbs, flowers, and incense. Some even carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with fragrant materials that could be sniffed to block out unpleasant odors. Think of it as medieval Febreze you wore around your neck. Wealthy folks sometimes paid good money for imported spices like cloves or cinnamon, just to smell a little less like pigsty. Meanwhile, if you were poor, you didn't have cloves. You had hope. And finally, let's talk about grooming rituals for special occasions. Weddings, feasts, or religious holidays were times when people really tried to look their best. That meant washing more thoroughly, putting on cleaner clothes, combing out the lice, maybe even trimming nails. Some nobles went all out, dousing themselves in perfume and herbs until they were practically walking spice racks. But even at their cleanest, medieval people were operating on a very different baseline than us. All right, that's enough combing through medieval hair and beauty routines for tonight. In our next part, we'll wander into the broader picture. So, let's float from the bathroom and the combs into the wider, stranger world of medieval medicine. Because hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't just about whether you smelled bad. It was tied up with how people thought health and disease worked. And spoiler, they had some interesting theories. The main idea floating around medieval Europe was something called the humoral theory. This came from ancient Greek medicine, and it basically said that your health depended on balancing 4 bodily fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you had too much or too little of one, you'd get sick. Logical? Kind of. Evidence-based? Not really, but it shaped how people lived for centuries. So how does hygiene fit in? Well, people believed that filth, bad smells, and corrupted air could disturb your humors. Enter the concept of miasma, the idea that disease was spread by foul odors or poisonous vapors. If the air smelled rotten, that meant sickness was floating around. And this belief basically guided medieval public health. Take the Black Death in the 14th century. Doctors and priests agreed it was caused by bad air, which meant the cure was air fresheners. Towns burned huge piles of herbs, flowers, or even tar to purify the atmosphere. People carried posies of flowers or wore pomanders around their necks to block out the stink. That's why nursery rhymes like "Ring Around the Rosy," yes, the plague one, mention roses and pockets full of posies. It wasn't just poetry, it was survival strategy, or at least their version of it. Bathing, meanwhile, was a medical dilemma. On the one hand, being clean was good. On the other, remember the belief that hot water opened pores? Doctors thought this left the body dangerously exposed to miasma. So during epidemics, public bathhouses often shut down, and people who might have normally bathed once or twice a month decided it was safer not to, which, if you're picturing the smell of a medieval town during plague years, yeah, not great. Medicine itself often involved hygiene-adjacent remedies. Doctors prescribed washing hands and faces with vinegar, which they believed could ward off disease. Vinegar was the medieval equivalent of hand sanitizer, though without the helpful little aloe vera scent. They also recommended fumigating clothes with herbs, or smoking out houses with juniper or rosemary. Again, with the rosemary. Honestly, medieval Europe must have smelled like one giant roast chicken. And then there were plague doctors. You know, the iconic beaked masks. Those weren't fashion statements. They were air filters. The long beak was stuffed with herbs, flowers, and spices to protect the doctor from inhaling miasma. It didn't work, obviously, but at least they looked dramatic. Imagine being on your deathbed, and the last thing you see is a man dressed like a bird sniffing lavender. Comforting. Cleanliness also intersected with religion. Christianity preached purity of the soul, but attitudes toward the body were complicated. Some holy people deliberately avoided bathing as a sign of piety. Dirt on the outside was seen as irrelevant compared to cleanliness of spirit. In fact, saints and monks were sometimes admired for being filthy. It proved they weren't vain. So, yes, while some nobles soaked in rose petal baths, others thought smelling like goat pen was basically a ticket to heaven. Hospitals, such as they were, focused more on prayer and spiritual healing than on physical cleanliness. To be fair, medieval hospitals did provide food, rest, and a relatively safe environment, which was sometimes all a sick person needed, but you weren't going to get a sterile room or antiseptic tools. Surgeons reused instruments without cleaning them, and hand washing before surgery wasn't even a thought. You'd get bandages, yes, but often made from whatever linen scraps were lying around. So the hygiene situation in medicine was, let's say, optimistic. Public health on a city scale was equally patchy. Medieval towns did attempt to keep things clean. Regulations existed to control where butchers could slaughter animals, how tanners disposed of waste, and where people could dump sewage. But with limited infrastructure, enforcement was weak. Streets often doubled as garbage dumps, and rivers were basically flowing trash cans. London's Thames was famously filthy, clogged with refuse from thousands of households. Paris's Seine wasn't much better, and yet people still drank from them, because water is water, right? One of the strangest things medieval doctors recommended for staying healthy was avoiding foul company. Not morally foul, but literally smelly people. If someone stank, they were assumed to be contagious, which honestly wasn't always wrong, but it meant that hygiene became a kind of social marker. If you smelled clean, by medieval standards, it meant you were safer to be around, which is probably why perfumes and herbal sachets became so important. And let's not forget dentistry. We touched on tooth powders earlier, but medicine also had its say. Doctors recommended rinsing your mouth with wine or vinegar to keep gums healthy. Toothaches were sometimes treated with strange remedies, like pressing garlic to the gums, or even, this one's real, stuffing a frog in your mouth to draw out the pain, which must have worked wonders for your breath. So, overall, medieval medicine and hygiene were deeply connected. Cleanliness mattered. but not in the way we think of today. It was about balancing humors, blocking bad smells, and keeping evil vapors out of your body, which meant a world where people were terrified of roses losing their fragrance, but totally fine drinking water filled with sewage. All right, let's gently drift away from the doctors and hospitals, and in the next part, we'll move into something lighter. So we've wandered through bathhouses, lice combs, and plague doctors' perfume-filled beaks. Now, let's sit down at a medieval dining table. Because if you thought bathing was inconsistent, wait until you see what counted as table manners. First of all, forks, or more accurately, the lack of them. In most of medieval Europe, forks were considered odd, foreign, or even sinful for much of the Middle Ages. Why would you need a pronged stick when God gave you fingers? So the standard way of eating was with your hands, sometimes assisted by a knife. And yes, this meant greasy, saucy food was handled directly, then passed to your mouth, then wiped somewhere, hopefully a napkin, but often your sleeve or just the tablecloth, which by the end of a feast looked like it had fought a losing battle against gravy. Now, to be fair, hand washing was a thing. Before and after meals, basins of water were brought around so guests could rinse. Servants would pour water over your hands into a bowl, and you'd dry them on a communal towel. Very elegant, except, of course, that the water wasn't changed between every guest. So, basically, you were just washing your hands in everyone else's soup. At noble feasts, hygiene was a kind of performance. Lords and ladies wanted to show off not just their wealth, but their refinement. So there were rules. Don't put your whole hand in the stew. Don't lick the serving spoon. Don't sneeze into the platter of roasted peacock. You know, basic courtesies. But for peasants who ate simpler meals at home, hygiene was much more casual. A pot of stew might be shared by the whole family, everyone dipping in with bread or spoons, which meant if one person had a cold, congratulations, everyone was getting it. Speaking of bread, let's talk about trenchers. Instead of plates, many medieval people ate off thick slabs of stale bread. Food was piled on top, and when you were done, you could eat the bread, or toss it to the poor, or to the dogs lurking under the table. Convenient, yes. Hygienic? Debatable. Imagine all the meat juices and sauces soaking into your bread plate, then being passed around. It was the medieval version of using your leftovers as Tupperware. Drinks weren't much cleaner. Water was often unsafe to drink in towns, so ale and weak beer were the everyday beverages. Wine, if you were wealthy. Cups were sometimes shared, passed down the table. So, if you've ever been squeamish about double dipping, medieval feasts were not for you. And let's not forget teeth. Remember the oyster shell toothpaste? Not everyone used it. So, when you picture a great medieval banquet hall filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of goblets, also picture the collective smell of hundreds of unbrushed mouths washed down with ale. Romantic. Now, animals, hygiene, and dining were complicated by the fact that medieval towns weren't just full of people. They were full of livestock, chickens, pigs, goats, even cows sometimes wandered through streets or yards, which meant meals were often accompanied by flies, fleas, and other uninvited guests. Kitchens had their own problems. Meat left hanging for days, fish that wasn't quite fresh, bread crawling with weevils. But hey, a little extra protein. Despite this, there were rituals meant to keep things respectable. Nobles often washed their hands with scented water before meals, sometimes even rose water if they could afford it. Guests might be given herbs or spices to chew on as breath fresheners. Parsley was popular. Imagine your host leaning over and politely offering you a sprig of greenery, essentially saying, "Please, for the love of St. George, fix your breath before you sit next to me." And then there was table etiquette. Books were written about it. Don't pick your teeth with your knife. Don't scratch yourself while eating. Don't dip your greasy fingers back into the communal salt dish. All rules that tell us exactly what people were doing. Because if someone has to write down, "Don't wipe your nose on the tablecloth," that means people were absolutely wiping their noses on the tablecloth. For the lower classes, meals were more straightforward, but still involved some hygiene attempts. Families often ate together from one pot, using spoons or hunks of bread. Washing hands before meals was encouraged, especially in monasteries, where rules were stricter, but soap wasn't always available. So water had to do, which meant that clean hands were relative. Food preservation was another interesting part of hygiene. Salt was the medieval refrigerator. Meat was heavily salted or smoked to keep it from rotting. Fish was dried, pickled, or stored in barrels. Vegetables were turned into pickles or stews, which worked, but also meant your diet included a lot of salty, sour, or smoky flavors. Fresh food was a luxury, and if you got it, you probably ate it quickly, before it walked away on its own. And let's briefly mention feasting in times of plague. Yes, people still gathered, sometimes defiantly. Doctors warned against overindulgence, believing that heavy eating and drinking weakened the body and opened it up to miasma, which meant that in addition to worrying about fleas, rats, and bad air, you also had to think about whether that extra leg of goose might literally kill you. Dinner was complicated. All right, so at this point, we've seen that medieval hygiene didn't just stop at the bathhouse. It followed people straight to the dinner table. Messy hands, trenchers soaked in stew, communal cups, and a lot of rules that were mostly ignored. So, we've talked about baths, lice, and the greasy etiquette of dining tables. But to really understand hygiene in the Middle Ages, we need to step outside into the streets of a medieval town. And fair warning, it wasn't pretty. Imagine narrow lanes, packed with houses, leaning in so close they nearly touch at the top. No pavement, just dirt, mud, and whatever else got dumped there. And by whatever else, I mean everything. Waste from chamber pots, scraps from kitchens, the odd dead animal that no one felt like hauling away. Streets weren't just thoroughfares. They were open-air garbage bins, and they smelled like it. Human waste was the biggest issue. If you lived in a town, you probably had a chamber pot. In the morning, you'd empty it into the street or the nearest open sewer channel. Some towns had designated collection points, but let's be honest, people didn't always follow the rules, which meant that stepping outside your door was a gamble. You might end up with more on your shoes than you bargained for. Cities did try to regulate this. London, Paris, and other major towns issued ordinances banning people from throwing waste out of windows, which sounds great in theory. In practice, plenty of people still leaned out their shutters at night and shouted a polite warning before dumping the contents. Something along the lines of, "Gardes l'eau," watch out for the water, except it wasn't water. Imagine walking home late at night, hearing a shout, and then splash. Medieval nightlife at its finest. Animal waste was everywhere too. Cows, pigs, and horses lived inside towns, and someone had to deal with their droppings, which often meant no one did. Butchers slaughtered animals in open-air markets, blood running down the streets. Tanneries dumped vats of chemical-soaked hides into rivers, and fishmongers left piles of scales and bones behind. So, if you've ever complained about your local garbage day, just remember, it could be worse. Speaking of rivers, they were both lifeline and latrine. People drank from them, washed clothes in them, and also dumped sewage directly into them. London's Thames was notorious for its filth. The same water that carried away waste was brought back inside for cooking, which explains a lot about medieval stomach problems. Wells were safer, but even those could get contaminated if a latrine was dug too close. And yes, sometimes people found out the hard way. Now, let's drift over to public baths. Earlier, we mentioned that bathhouses were fairly common, at least in earlier centuries. These weren't just for washing. They were social spaces. People went to relax, gossip, even do business. And yes, sometimes they doubled as other kinds of establishments, which gave them a bad reputation. By the later Middle Ages, many bathhouses closed, partly because of morality concerns, and partly because people thought they spread disease. So the one semi-public option for getting clean largely disappeared. Street cleaning was theoretically managed by city authorities. In practice, it was usually done by residents. Sometimes each household was responsible for the patch of street in front of their door, which worked if you cared. If you didn't, well, the mess piled up. There are records of city councils hiring rakers to shovel filth away. These were not glamorous jobs. Imagine spending your life literally shoveling medieval waste into carts, hauling it outside city walls, and dumping it in designated pits. It kept things slightly less awful. Smell was constant. Chroniclers describe towns as stinking or foul. But here's the thing. People were used to it. To medieval noses, the scent of dung and rot was normal background noise. What shocked them was new smells, like exotic spices or imported perfumes, which meant that a noble dripping with rose water and musk must have seemed both dazzling and maybe a little suspicious. Interestingly, some cities tried to beautify their stinky streets. They spread herbs like lavender or mint in public places, especially during festivals. Churches burned incense, partly for religious reasons, but also because it masked the smell of sweaty worshippers packed into the nave. Markets sometimes scattered straw to soak up mud and other things. It didn't solve the problem, but it made walking a little less disgusting. Public latrines also existed, Large towns sometimes built them near rivers or bridges. Basically, big wooden structures with rows of seats. Think medieval porta potties, but without the chemical freshness. They served dozens of people at once, which was convenient, but also not very private, and definitely not very clean. Still, it was better than nothing. Of course, rural areas had their own version of hygiene challenges. Villages didn't have crowded streets, but waste disposal was still basic. Pits, fields, or rivers. And farm animals lived very close to humans, sometimes even sharing the same building, which meant that while the air was fresher, the floors might not be. So overall, public hygiene in medieval Europe was a mix of small, well-meaning efforts drowned out by sheer volume of filth. Cities passed laws, hired cleaners, and built latrines, but without modern sewage systems, it was like bailing water out of a sinking ship with a wooden spoon. And so, when we think about medieval hygiene, it's worth remembering that the Middle Ages were not a single block of filth and ignorance, nor were they a golden age of cleanliness. Hygiene in those centuries was a patchwork, sometimes surprisingly advanced, other times shockingly unhygienic. People did bathe, but not always as often as we would today. They brushed their teeth, but with twigs or salt. They washed clothes, but only when absolutely necessary. And while public bathhouses once thrived, fears of disease and moral decline saw them close their doors. What really shaped medieval hygiene was not just the lack of modern plumbing or soap factories, but a mindset shaped by faith, environment, and survival. For peasants, water was both a necessity and a danger. Fresh streams might keep you alive, but polluted rivers could just as easily spread disease. For nobles, scented oils and perfumes sometimes replaced a bath, while doctors debated whether too much bathing might actually make you sick. Monks, with their rules of washing before prayer, were perhaps the cleanest of all, though even their habits changed as centuries passed. When we look at it all together, we see a world where cleanliness was always relative. Compared to our modern obsession with daily showers, toothpaste, deodorant, and sanitizers, the medieval approach feels alien, and yet, to them, it made sense. Hygiene was not about sparkling perfection, but about balance, keeping the body functional, the soul pure, and the household just clean enough to get by. So the next time someone says, "People in the Middle Ages never bathed," you'll know that's only half true. The reality was much messier, much more human, filled with people doing their best with what they had, just as we do today. And with that, we close the chapter on medieval hygiene, another glimpse into the past. Not glamorous, not always pleasant, but undeniably fascinating. So, if you're listening to this as you drift off to sleep, let these stories remind you that even the simplest acts, like washing your hands or brushing your teeth, connect us to people who lived centuries ago. Their struggles, their habits, and their strange little rituals have shaped the world we now take for granted. Good night, and may your dreams be a little cleaner than a medieval bathhouse.